Greetings, sailors, and welcome to, 2019, and an Acasta replay. I've picked this one out because it is a fairly decent game, but mostly I wanted something as a bit of background, because today I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some local history that's quite relevant to ships and sailors and boaty things. Unfortunately, it's not a particularly happy bit of history, but it is the centenary of that particular bit of history, and so today is the day to talk about it. Now, of course, last year marked the centenary of the end of World War I, and there were a lot of events happening in the UK and other places around that, and for most people that would have been a fairly happy event, you know, the end of what was a fairly horrible meat grinder of a war. But here in the Outer Hebrides, it maybe has a slightly different connotation. The Hebrides and, well, I think the Highlands and Islands generally were already fairly hard hit by World War I. The UK as a whole lost, I can't even remember the exact percentage, but a fairly significant proportion of its male population. The Hebrides in particular lost about a fifth of their total population in World War I, just men dying on the Western Front, and probably a few sailors as well. There were quite a high proportion of people who were naval reservists. And some of those, a lot of those, after the cessation of hostilities, well, they didn't get to return home right away. It wasn't until basically the end of the year, around about now, that they were given the chance to return. Some were demobbed, and others were just let go for leave. Now, what happened was a whole bunch of these sailors from Lewis and Harris, several hundred of them, set off from the port of Kyle of Lacalche on the evening of the 31st December 1918. There were two ships that were heading back to the Hebrides that evening. One was a Royal Mail steamer called the Sheila, which was heading to Skye and then Tarbert, which is one of the main villages in Harris, and that carried the majority of the men who were travelling back to Harris. The other was HMY Iolaire, which was a yacht that had been pressed into Royal Navy service and was rated to carry about 100 people at a maximum. It left Kyle of Lacalche that evening carrying nearly 300. It's around 283, but the records are a bit inexact. It was, however, grossly overcrowded. It had like 2 lifeboats and, from what I've read, enough lifebelts for about 80 people. So you can get some idea from this that if something went wrong, it was going to go very, very badly wrong. Most of the men on board were not soldiers. In fact, I don't know if there were any soldiers on board, but they were mostly Royal Navy sailors and Navy reservists returning from service, all over the place, I would guess. I don't know too many details on who served where, but there were a lot of reservists that came from the Hebrides, and for many of them this would have been the first time they got to come home in, years. Now, there's one important thing to note about the Iolaire. They'd never sailed to Stornoway before. They'd never sailed across the Minch and into Stornoway Harbour. This was basically them doing this for the first time, and yes, they had charts, but they didn't know the waters. They were also doing it very late at night and in not particularly calm seas. It's winter in the North Atlantic, after all, which is not a guarantee of stormy weather, but it's not exactly uncommon. Fast forward to about 2:30 in the morning as the ship was approaching Stornoway. And a thing to know about the approach to Stornoway is that there's a particular group of rocks known as the Beasts of Holm. which are quite dangerous. I've actually been out to the Beasts of Holm in a small boat, and even then there were lots of precautions being taken that we didn't run aground. Basically, they are just below the water, and unless you know they are there, they are not particularly visible. Now, there is a marker buoy these days, but I don't know that there would have been in 1919. So you can picture the scene. It is pitch black. The water's quite rough.
Problem solved, sir.
None of the actual crew of the Iolaire know the approach, and so what happened was they came in much too far east and struck the beasts. This was close enough to Stornoway that they would have been able to see the lights of town. As I say, I've been out there, and it is really just outside the main harbour. In fact, the beasts themselves are not that far offshore. I've seen them, as I've said, both from on the water and from the shoreline. And when you're on the shoreline, on a calm day, it really doesn't look so far out. When you're out on the water, however, suddenly it seems a lot further away. So you've got a grossly overcrowded ship that's just run aground in stormy weather. It's pitch black. There's not enough lifebelts. There's only 2 lifeboats. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. And as you can imagine, the result was pretty horrible. Of the 283 people that were known to be aboard, and bear in mind it could have been a couple of more, at least 201. In fact, I think the official figure was 205, but again, it's a bit fuzzy around the edges. At least 201 of those returning servicemen, and I think most of the crew of the ship as well, drowned just a couple of miles from home. Now, as I've said, the islands were already reeling from the loss of life from World War I. This blow on top of that, well, you can imagine perhaps why this still resonates quite so keenly today. There is one particular little story of heroism, I guess you could say, that comes out of this. One of the sailors on board, John F. MacLeod from the village of Ness, up in the north of the island, was responsible for saving 40 of his fellow sailors by swimming ashore with a line, and another 40 or so men were able to make their way to the shoreline. But of the 280 odd people on board, only just over 80 survived. And given that you can find memorials in just about every village on the island to those lost in the First World War, the bitterness of this loss on top of what had already been a horrendous meat grinder of a war for the islands, and just Britain generally. Yeah, the memory of that wasn't going to go away anytime soon, and it hasn't gone away. It's something I learned about in school here, and you'd think it would be a bit more known around the rest of the UK as well, given that it was one of the worst maritime disasters in British waters of the 20th century. But it does seem to be comparatively unknown outside of the Hebrides. So maybe a few more people learned about it today, hopefully. You can obviously go and read a bit more about it yourself. There are even a number of very good books that have been written about it, and the aftermath that share some of the stories of the men and the families, the survivors, and those that lost people. So if you want to know more, there is definitely information out there, but given the local importance of this event, I kind of felt like I had to mark it somehow and try and bring a bit more attention to it than I think it otherwise has gotten. So on to a less sombre subject, that is the rest of this replay. The Acasta I've only played a couple of games in, and this is going to be by far the best of them, but generally speaking it doesn't seem to have garnered a particularly good reputation. But to be fair to it, most of the tier 5 destroyers don't have a particularly good reputation. In fact, it really is only the premium tier 5 destroyers that are particularly strong. The only ones that can reliably stealth drop don't get a lot of torps, and they tend to be rather slower torps these days. Once upon a time the Minikaze was a bit of a terror at tier 5, but these days if you want that older flavour of Minikaze you have to play one of the Kamikaze sisters. And as for the rest of them, most of them really, they either can't stealth torp or they can only just barely stealth torp. And with the Acasta, it technically you could drop torpedoes into somebody's path if they were advancing towards you, but otherwise you're not going to be stealth torping, and so you rely a lot on the guns instead. They aren't bad guns though, these 120 mils, and as you can see in this game I've been putting them to pretty good use. So I think in that regard this ship does fare better than something like the T-22. But having said that, when you're down tiered especially, and you're going to be facing destroyers that have better guns or more guns than you do, it does make a big difference. This matchmaking is letting me get away with a lot, but I've also had some particularly juicy low health targets to fire at different times as well. So with that battleship out of the way, that gives me a free shot at these enemy carriers, and that's also my first kill, I believe. So just by having done a reasonable amount of damage, it's only just now lets me getting my first kill, but I can't complain about the damage too much. That's really not too shabby for these guns at all, and it really does come down to the number of fires I've had. I mean, the actual guns themselves, they're pretty good, but you need to get the fires to rack up appreciable amounts of damage. Both the carriers are understandably going to be slightly concerned about my presence at this stage, I expect. But here's where this has another advantage that all of the other tier 5 destroyers don't. It has that British acceleration going on, which becomes especially useful when you're duking around and trying to dodge carrier drops. Did I say I was top tier? I wasn't top tier in this one. This was a tier 6 game, but it was still pretty good matchmaking, all things considered. So of the two carriers, well, of course the Independents can make manual drops, but even so, trying to drop on a destroyer that's actively dodging is not the easiest thing in the world. At these tiers anyway. Once you get to higher tiers and some of the destroyers start to have very wide turning radiuses, it becomes a lot easier to try and nail them, especially when you're in a Japanese carrier that has multiple squads and you can cross-drop people. I've had many a nasty experience in my Shimakaze, especially because it just does not turn very well at all. And even other destroyers, even if they have a better turning radius nominally, if you're whizzing around with your speed boost going, then that can also make it a lot harder to dodge. So there is my one and only successful torp drop in this game, taking out that Zuiho, who really made it quite easy for me by backing into, well, running forward into an island and then just backing out nicely into my torpedoes. And if I keep peppering away, I can get the Independence, and then that'll just leave the Nürnberg, who is also very low health, so I might even have a shot at taking them out as well. In fact, it looks like I was going to try focusing them first, which makes sense, because if you can shoot the thing and take out the thing that is actively shooting back at you versus a carrier which doesn't have any player controllable guns, then that's usually the more sensible option. And we're also topped out 100k damage at this point, and I'd be happy with that in my tier 10 destroyers, quite frankly. But to get it in a tier 5 destroyer with a not very good reputation, it feels like this was a pretty decent game, all things considered. So that's kill number 3. And that just leaves the Independence. And unless the New York gets lucky, I think I will probably have this. I think this will probably be my kill. Although, there are some dive bombers coming in. I guess we'll see what kind of RNG the Independence gets out of this, because I am low enough health that it could kill me. Fortunately, it doesn't. It hurts, it sets a fire, but it doesn't just outright blow me out of the water. So there's the final kill, and because this was during the Ovechkin event, it was a 4-goal haul as well, alongside a Confederate medal and, of course, a devastating strike on the Zwiho. 108k damage done, 4 kills, top of the team, 1500 base XP. Yeah, that was quite a good game for the Acasta, I think. Hell, if I managed that kind of game in a Kamikaze, I'd probably be quite pleased with myself, but I don't play that ship very often. I can't even remember why I picked out the Acasta for this particular match. It was a platoon match, and I guess I just wanted a tier 5. I hadn't played much. I don't know. So yeah, this was a replay I did want to show at some point, but it was a bit... I mean, it was basically me running around going pew 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 over and over again. It was one of those games. And they can be maybe not the most interesting to narrate, even if they are quite decent matches in their own right. But as I said, you know, unless you were asleep for the first half of this video, this was more about having something to have in the background whilst I talked about other things. So, a Happy New Year to you all, wherever you may be. I hope you all have a better 2019 than you had 2018. And of course, all that remains for me to say is, as ever, stay tuned for more.